The stars looked the same as they always did through the viewing window of the military space station called Watchtower 7, and Captain Rebecca Torres stood there watching them with her arms crossed over her chest and her mind wandering too. Thoughts of home and family, and whether she had made the right choice, joining the Deep Space Patrol Division 5 years ago. When everything seemed so much simpler than it did now, the coffee in her hand had gone cold hours ago, but she kept holding it anyway, because it gave her something to do with her hands while she thought about the reports that had been coming in from the outer sectors, and none of them made any sense at all, because the detection systems kept picking up strange signals that appeared and disappeared before anyone could get a proper reading on them. Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez came walking into the observation deck with a tablet computer in her hands and an expression on her face that told Rebecca something important had happened, and whatever it was probably meant more work for everyone on the station. They already had too much work to handle with their limited crew of only 40 people. Maya stopped next to Rebecca and held out the tablet without saying anything at first, and Rebecca took it and looked at the screen, which showed a complex wave pattern that seemed to pulse and shift in ways that normal radio signals just did not do, and there were symbols mixed in with the waves that looked almost like writing, but in a language that Rebecca had never seen before in all her years of studying alien communications. Rebecca looked at Maya and raised one eyebrow in a silent question, and Maya finally spoke up, saying that the signal had been detected 3 hours ago by the long-range listening post on the edge of the solar system, and it had taken this long to relay it back to Watchtower 7 because of the distance involved and the need to boost the signal strength multiple times just to make it readable. The signal was strange because it seemed to be a distress call based on the urgent repetition and the way it kept broadcasting over and over without stopping, but it was written in a language that the computer databases said belonged to a civilization called the Volari, who had supposedly gone extinct more than 3,000 years ago, according to the limited records that human explorers had found in abandoned ruins scattered across several different star systems. Rebecca handed the tablet back to Maya and asked if anyone had tried to translate the message yet, and Maya nodded and said that the linguistics team had been working on it for the past 2 hours using every database and translation algorithm they could access, and they had managed to decode about 60% of the content, which was enough to understand the basic meaning even if some details remained unclear. The message talked about something called the Scourge, which seemed to be some kind of terrible enemy or threat that was destroying entire worlds and killing billions of people, and the message was calling out to the ancient alliance of civilizations that had fought against the Scourge the last time it appeared, which was apparently thousands of years in the past, when the Volari were still alive and thriving. Maya explained that the message specifically called for help from several civilizations by name, including the Volari themselves and the Korath Empire and the Elvani Coalition, and a few others that the translation team could not identify because the words were too corrupted, or the human databases simply did not have any information about those particular species. Rebecca walked away from the window and sat down in one of the chairs near the wall and thought about what this all meant, because if someone was sending out a distress call in an ancient language asking for help from civilizations that no longer existed, then either it was some kind of historical recording that had been accidentally activated, or there was someone out there who genuinely believed that the old alliance could still help them. Maya sat down across from Rebecca and said that the science team had analyzed the signal origin point and determined that it was coming from a star system called Andara, which was located deep in uncharted space, about 6 light years beyond the furthest human colony, and it would take almost a week of faster-than-light travel to reach it, even at maximum speed. Rebecca knew what she should do according to regulations and protocols, because whenever something unusual happened in deep space, the standard procedure was to report it to Central Command and wait for orders before taking any action. But something about this situation felt different and more urgent than the typical strange signal or anomaly that patrols encountered. Maya seemed to sense what Rebecca was thinking, because she leaned forward and said quietly that if this really was a distress call from someone facing an existential threat, then waiting several days for command to review the report and send back Orders might mean arriving too late to help anyone and finding only dead worlds and empty. Space Rebecca looked at her second-in-command and asked what Maya thought they should do, and Maya did not hesitate before saying that they should go and investigate, because that was what patrol ships were supposed to do. When they encountered potential threats or situations that required immediate response, and besides, the Defiance was fully equipped and capable of handling most combat situations even without backup from other ships. The Defiance was the patrol ship assigned to Watchtower 7, and it was a good vessel with strong shields and weapons, and a crew of 25 people who knew their jobs well and trusted each other after serving together for more than 2 years, and Rebecca had confidence in their abilities even. She worried about leading them into an unknown situation. Rebecca stood up and told Maya to assemble the senior staff for a briefing in 30 minutes and to begin preparations for departure, including plotting a course to the Indara system and running full diagnostics on all ship systems, because she wanted everything working perfectly before they jumped into faster-than-light travel. Maya smiled and gave a quick nod before hurrying out of the observation deck to carry out the orders, and Rebecca stayed behind for a moment longer, looking out at the stars and wondering what they would find when they reached their destination, and whether they were making the right choice or walking into something far more dangerous than any of them. I could imagine the briefing went quickly because everyone understood the situation and agreed that responding to a distress call was the right thing to do, regardless of whether it was meant for humans or for some long-dead alien civilization. And the crew of the Defiance began their preparations. With practiced efficiency, Rebecca walked through the ship, checking on different stations and talking to crew members and making sure everyone understood their roles and responsibilities for the mission ahead. And everywhere she went, she saw determination and focus on the faces around her, which gave her confidence that they could handle whatever waited for them in the Indara system. The ship departed from Watchtower 7 exactly 4 hours after the signal was first detected, and as they accelerated away from the station, Rebecca stood on the bridge watching the stars stretch and blur as the faster-than-light drives engaged and carried them toward the unknown at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a few generations ago. The journey would take 6 days, and during that time the crew maintained their normal routines as much as possible, with regular shift rotations and meals in the common areas and exercise periods in the small gym, and even some entertainment during off-duty hours, because keeping morale high during long trips was important for maintaining alertness and readiness. Rebecca spent much of her time studying everything the human databases contained about the Valari and the other civilizations mentioned in the distress call, and she learned that the Valari had been highly advanced with technology that surpassed what humans had even now. And they had been known for their skill in creating powerful weapons and defensive systems. The information about the Scourge was limited and mostly came from fragmented historical records found in ruins. But what little existed painted a picture of something truly terrifying that consumed entire star systems and could not be stopped by conventional weapons or tactics, and had only been defeated through desperate sacrifices and the combined efforts of multiple civilizations working together. The Defiance dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Indara system, and what appeared on the view screen made every person on the bridge stop and stare in shocked silence, because the space around them was filled with debris and wreckage from what must have been hundreds of ships, and the scale of the destruction was beyond anything any of them had ever seen before in their careers. Rebecca gripped the armrests of her command chair and ordered the tactical officer to run full scans of the area and identify any active threats, while the navigation officer plotted potential escape routes in case they needed to retreat quickly, and the communications officer tried to detect any signals or transmissions that might indicate survivors. The debris field stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction, and the ships that floated dead in the void came in dozens of different designs and configurations that suggested they belonged to many different civilizations and cultures, and all of them had been torn apart by something incredibly powerful that had ripped through their hulls like they were made of paper. Maya stood next to Rebecca and pointed at one of the larger pieces of wreckage that drifted past their position, and said quietly that the metal looked strange and almost corroded, as if something had eaten away at its molecular structure, and the Edges where the ship had been torn apart did not look like damage from weapons, but rather like the metal had simply ceased to exist, though. Tactical officer reported that scans were detecting unusual energy readings from deeper in the system near the fourth planet, and the readings did not match any known power signatures in the human databases and seemed to pulse and fluctuate in patterns that made the scanning equipment malfunction and require constant recalibration. Recorded the helm to proceed toward the fourth planet at 1/4 speed, with shields at maximum and all weapon systems ready to fire at a moment's notice, and she told the crew to stay alert because whatever had destroyed all these ships might still be in the area and could attack at any time. They had only been traveling for 20 minutes when the thing appeared, and at first, Rebecca thought it was another ship, but then she realized that it was something far worse and far stranger than any vessel she had ever encountered, because its surface seemed to be made of living darkness that writhed and twisted and changed shape constantly. The thing was massive and easily 10 times larger than the Defiance, and it moved through space without any visible propulsion system, and from its core extended long tendrils of shadow that reached out in every direction, and wherever those tendrils touched solid matter, that matter simply vanished, as if it had never existed. Almia shouted for evasive maneuvers, and the helm officer threw the ship into a hard bank to the right that pushed everyone against their seats with the force of acceleration, and one of the shadow tendrils passed through the space where the Defiance had been just seconds before, and Rebecca felt her heart pounding as she realized how close they had come to destruction. The weapons officer fired the main cannons and launched several missiles at the creature, and the projectiles streaked across the void, trailing fire and smoke, but when they hit the target, they passed right through the darkness without causing any visible damage. And it was like trying to fight a ghost or a shadow that could not be touched or harmed by physical force. Rebecca ordered the tactical officer to try different weapon frequencies and energy types, and for the next several minutes the crew threw everything they had at the creature, including plasma bolts and laser beams and kinetic penetrators and explosive warheads, but nothing worked, and the thing kept advancing toward them with its tendrils reaching out hungrily. The communications console suddenly lit up with an incoming transmission, and the officer announced that someone was hailing them on an emergency frequency. And Rebecca told them to put it through, and a voice came over the speakers, speaking in heavily accented but understandable English. The voice identified itself as Envoy Lyra of the Elvani Coalition and told them that they needed to run immediately, because the Scourge could not be fought with primitive weapons, and they would only die if they stayed and tried to engage it in combat like all the others who had come before them. Rebecca grabbed the microphone and identified herself in the Defiance, and said that they had received the distress signal and had come to help, and there was a long pause before Lyra responded with what sounded like a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Lyra asked how humans had managed to decode and understand a message written in ancient Velair, which should have been impossible for a species as young and technologically limited as humanity, and Rebecca did not have a good answer, except to say that they had smart people and good computers and a lot of determination. Elvani Envoy laughed, but it was a bitter sound without any real humor, and she said that determination would not help against the Scourge, which had already destroyed 17 colonies and killed billions of people over the past 3 weeks, and the combined fleets of 4 different civilizations had failed to stop it or even slow it down. Rebecca asked if there was any way to fight the creature, and Lyra hesitated before saying that there was one possibility, but it would require a sacrifice that her people were unwilling to make, and she did not think humans would be willing either, but she supposed there was no harm in explaining, since they were probably going to die anyway. Ira told them about an ancient weapon that had been built by the first Volari scientists during the last emergence of the Scourge thousands of years ago, and the weapon had worked by using exotic matter to destabilize the quantum bonds that held the Scourge together and cause it to collapse in on itself and disappear. The problem was that the weapon had to be piloted manually, because the Scourge could adapt to and jam any kind of remote control signal, and the pilot would have to fly directly into the heart of the creature and detonate the weapon from inside, which meant certain death for whoever took on that mission. Rebecca asked where this weapon was located, and Lyra gave them coordinates for a small moon on the far side of the system where the ancient Valari had built a hidden facility to store their most dangerous and powerful creations, and the Alvani had been trying for 3 weeks to modify the weapon to work with remote guidance, but had failed. Every time Maya looked at Rebecca with an expression that clearly said this was a terrible idea and they should not even consider it, but Rebecca was already thinking about all the people who had died and all the worlds that had been destroyed, and she knew that someone had to try even if the chances of success were slim. Rebecca told Lyra to send them the exact location and access codes for the facility, and there was another long pause before the Alvani envoy asked if the humans were really planning to attempt this suicide mission, and Rebecca said yes, because that was what you did when someone asked for help. The journey to the moon took 3 hours, and during that time, the Scourge fortunately did not pursue them, but instead continued toward another group of ships that had appeared on the far side of the system. And Rebecca tried not to think about the people on those vessels who were about to experience the same terror and destruction that she had just witnessed. The ancient facility was hidden deep beneath the surface of the moon and protected by security systems that were still functional after thousands of years, and it took the combined efforts of the Defiance crew and the Alvani technicians working remotely to bypass the locks and open the massive doors inside. They found a chamber that looked like it belonged in a museum, with walls covered in strange symbols and machinery that hummed with barely contained power, and at the center of it all sat a small fighter craft that was sleek and beautiful and deadly in a way that made Rebecca both admired and feared. At Lyra appeared on the communication screen and explained that the plane weapon was charged and ready to use, but someone would need to pilot it, and she had been preparing to take on that duty herself when the humans had arrived. And now she did not know what to do, because she did not want to die, but she also could not ask someone else to make that sacrifice. Looked at the fighter craft and thought about her crew and her family back home and all the things she still wanted to do with her life, but she also thought about the billions of people who had already died and the billions more who would die if the Scourge was not stopped. Rebecca walked slowly toward the ancient fighter craft and ran her hand along its smooth surface, which felt warm to the touch despite having sat dormant in this underground facility for thousands of years, and she could feel the power contained within it humming just below the surface, like a sleeping predator waiting to be awakened. Maya followed close behind and grabbed Rebecca by the shoulder and spun her around and said with more emotion than Rebecca had ever heard from her normally calm second command that there had to be another way, and they could not just accept that someone had to die without exploring every possible alternative first. The communications screen flickered and showed Lyra materializing in the chamber through some kind of advanced holographic projection system, and the Alvani woman was tall and graceful, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light, and eyes that glowed with a soft amber color that spoke of wisdom and sadness. Lyra looked at Rebecca and Maya and said that she understood their reluctance, because her own people had been arguing about this same issue for 3 weeks, and many brave volunteers had stepped forward willing to pilot the weapon, but each time the Alvani Council had refused to authorize the mission, saying that they would not sacrifice their people when there might be another solution. Rebecca asked what had changed and why. Lyra was now willing to take on the mission herself, and the Alvani envoy explained that she had finally realized that sometimes there was no perfect solution, and you had to choose between a terrible option and an even worse one, and watching the Scourge destroy more worlds while they debated was no longer acceptable. Maya pointed out that if the Alvani had been unwilling to sacrifice one of their own people, then why should humans be expected to do what they would not? And Lyra nodded slowly and said that Maya was absolutely right, and that was why Lyra had decided to pilot the weapon herself, without asking permission from her council. Rebecca looked at Lyra, and then at the fighter craft, and then back at Lyra again, and said that there might be a third option that no one had considered yet, and both Lyra and Maya turned to look at her with expressions of curiosity mixed with hope. Rebecca explained that the fighter only had one seat and one pilot interface, according to what Lyra had told them, but what if they modified it to accommodate Two people, with one handling the flight controls and the other managing the weapon systems and targeting, and two people working together might have a better chance of penetrating the scourge defenses than one person trying to do everything alone. Lyra studied Rebecca for a long moment and then said that the idea had merit, but it would still result in 2 deaths instead of 1, and she did not see how that made the situation any better, and besides, modifying the ancient technology might take days or weeks, and they did not have that kind of time. Maya suddenly spoke up and said that her engineering team could probably make the modifications in a few hours if they had help from the Elvani technicians and access to the fighter systems, and she had worked on similar integration projects before, when human ships needed to interface with alien technology, and this was just a larger version of the same basic problem. Rebecca looked at Maya and asked if she was volunteering to help with a suicide mission, and Maya shook her head and said no. She was volunteering to modify the ship so that Rebecca and Lyra could both survive, because Maya had an idea that might give them a chance to escape after deploying the weapon. The plan that Maya outlined was complex and risky, but it involved using the Defiance to create a massive gravitational distortion field at the exact moment when the weapon detonated. And if they timed it perfectly, the field might be strong enough to pull the fighter craft away from the Scourge before the explosion consumed it. Completely, Lyra listened to the explanation with growing interest, and then consulted with her own technical experts through her communication link, and after several minutes of rapid discussion in a language that sounded like musical chimes, she turned back to Rebecca and Maya and said that the theory was sound, but the margin for error was incredibly small. Rebecca made the decision quickly because that was what commanders had to do, and she told Maya to begin the modifications immediately, and to coordinate with the Elvani technicians, and to make sure every detail was checked and double-checked, because they would only get one chance at this. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as engineers from both species worked side by side to retrofit the ancient fighter with modern systems and integrate 2 separate control stations, and Maya supervised everything with the intensity and focus that made her such an excellent officer. Rebecca used the time to study the fighter systems and practice with the controls, because even though she was an experienced pilot, this craft was unlike anything she had ever flown before, and the interface was designed for Velari hands and eyes, and required significant adaptation to work with human physiology, appeared in person rather than as a hologram, and Rebecca was struck by how alien and yet somehow familiar she seemed with her graceful movements and thoughtful expressions, and the way she approached problems with a combination of logic and intuition that reminded Rebecca of the best officers she had served with. They talked while they worked and learned about each other and their respective civilizations, and Rebecca discovered that the Elvani valued art and philosophy as much as science and technology, and that Lyra herself was both a warrior and a scholar who had spent decades studying ancient history and lost civilizations. Lyra asked Rebecca about Earth and human culture and seemed fascinated by the idea of a species that had only recently developed space travel and yet had managed to decode ancient languages and respond to distress calls meant for civilizations thousands of years more advanced. Rebecca explained that humans had a tendency to try things that seemed impossible, and sometimes they succeeded through sheer, stubborn determination, and sometimes they failed spectacularly, but they kept trying anyway because giving up was not in their nature. The modifications were finally complete, and Maya ran through a final checklist while the Elvani technicians verified that all systems were functioning within acceptable parameters, and Rebecca and Lyra climbed into the cramped cockpit, which now had 2 seats pressed close together with barely enough room to move. Maya stood outside the fighter and looked up at Rebecca through the transparent canopy, and for a moment her professional composure cracked, and she said quietly that Rebecca had better come back alive, because Asuna did not want to have to explain to command why she let her captain fly a suicide mission. Rebecca smiled and said that Asuna would make an excellent captain herself if something did happen, and Maya shook her head and said that was not the point, and Rebecca needed to stop talking like she was already dead and focus on surviving instead. Fighter lifted off from the underground facility and shot out through the exit tunnel and into open space. and Rebecca felt the raw power of the ancient engines thrumming through the hull, and it was like riding a lightning bolt that barely responded to her. Controls Lyra handled the weapon systems with practiced ease and called out readings and status updates as they accelerated toward the location where the scourge had last been detected, and Rebecca focused on keeping the fighter stable and on course. While her heart hammered in her chest, they found the creature near. The fifth planet, consuming a massive space station that must have housed millions of people, and the screams coming over the emergency channels were cut off one by one as the shadow tendrils reached out and erased entire sections of the structure. Rebecca pushed the fighter to maximum speed and aimed directly at the center of the scourge, while Lyra armed the ancient weapon and began the charging sequence that would take 90 seconds to complete, and those 90 seconds felt like the longest. Of Rebecca Lifa, Scourge noticed them, and tendrils lashed out trying to intercept the fighter, but Rebecca dodged and weaved through the deadly maze with reflexes, honed by years of combat training, and twice the tendrils came so close that Rebecca could see the surface of the fighter beginning to corrode where the shadows touched Lyra, counted down the final seconds, and told Rebecca to prepare for maximum acceleration on her mark. And Rebecca gripped the controls so hard her knuckles turned white, and she thought about everyone depending on them and everyone who had already died, and she refused to let their deaths be meaningless. Fighter plunged into the heart of the scourge, and everything went dark and cold and wrong in ways that made Rebecca's stomach twist, and her sensors screamed warnings that made no sense because they reported that the space around them existed and did not exist at the same time, and matter was behaving in ways that violated every known law of physics. Lyra. The voice came through the communication system, strained and tight with effort, as she fought to keep the weapon systems stable in an environment that was trying to tear apart the very atoms that composed them. And she said that they had reached the optimal detonation point and asked if Rebecca was ready. Rebecca shouted yes over the roar of alarms and the screaming of metal being stressed beyond its design limits, and she activated the emergency thrusters that would push them away from the Shay detonation point at maximum acceleration. And at the same moment Lyra released the weapon, the explosion was unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced, and it was not fire or light, but rather a fundamental unmaking of reality itself, and she felt the fighter being pulled backward and forward and sideways all at once as space twisted and folded around them through the chaos. Rebecca heard Maya's voice coming over the long-range communication channel, saying that the Defiance was deploying the gravitational field and to hold on just a few more seconds, and those seconds stretched out like hours as reality bent and buckled. Then suddenly they were in normal space again, and the fighter was tumbling end over end with half its systems offline and smoke filling the cockpit, but they were alive. And when Rebecca looked at the view screen, she saw that the scourge was gone, leaving behind only empty space. Where it had been, Lyra was unconscious, slumped in her seat with blood trickling from her nose and ears, and Rebecca tried to call out to her, but her own voice sounded strange and distant, and she realized that she was probably in shock and possibly injured. Though she could not feel any pain through the adrenaline, the Defiance appeared beside them, and Maya's voice came through saying that they were locking on with a tractor beam and would pull them into the hangar bay, and medical teams were standing by. And Rebecca just needed to stay conscious for a few more minutes. Rebecca tried to respond, but her vision was going dark around the edges, and she felt consciousness slipping away despite her best efforts to hold on. And the last thing she remembered was Maya telling her that she had done it, and the scourge was destroyed, and billions of people were saved. When Rebecca woke up, she was in the medical bay of the Defiance, lying on a bed with various monitoring devices attached to her body, and her head felt like it had been used as a drum, and every muscle ached with the kind of deep pain that came from extreme physical stress. Maya was sitting in a chair beside the bed reading something on a tablet, and when she noticed Rebecca's eyes opening, she smiled with obvious relief and said that Rebecca had been unconscious for 18 hours, and the medical staff had been worried about brain damage from exposure to the exotic energies. Rebecca tried to sit up, but Maya pushed her gently back down and said that doctor orders were for complete rest, and that applied to stubborn captains just as much as anyone else. And besides, there were people who wanted to talk to Rebecca, and they could wait until she was properly recovered. Rebecca asked about Lyra and Maya. Expression became more serious as she explained that the Elvani envoy had been in worse condition than Rebecca and had required extensive medical intervention. Using techniques that combined human and Elvani medicine, and it had been touch and go for a while, but she was now stable. Maya went on to say that the destruction of the Scourge had been confirmed by multiple sensor readings from ships throughout the system, and the Elvani coalition sent a fleet to verify the results and provide aid to survivors, and the initial estimates suggested that the mission had prevented the deaths of at least 20 billion people across 7 different star systems. Rebecca absorbed this information slowly and tried to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished, but it felt surreal and distant, like something that had happened to someone else in a story rather than something she had actually done. Over the next few days, Rebecca recovered her strength, was finally allowed to leave the medical bay and walk around the ship and everywhere she went. Crew members congratulated her and thanked her and looked at her with expressions that made her uncomfortable because she did not feel like a hero. Lyra recovered more slowly, but eventually was well enough to meet with Rebecca in one of the conference rooms, and the two of them sat across from each other and shared a moment of quiet understanding because they had both faced death together and survived against impossible odds. Lyra told Rebecca that the Elvani Council had declared her and the entire crew of the Defiance to be friends and allies of the Coalition, which was an honor that had not been granted to any new species in more than 500 years and came with significant diplomatic and trade benefits. Rebecca said that they had only done what anyone would do when they received a distress call, and Lyra smiled and shook her head and said that was not true because the Elvani themselves had hesitated and debated while people died, and it took humans who were not even the intended recipients of the message to show them what courage really meant. The conversation turned to the broader implications of what had happened, and Lyra explained that the human response to the distress signal had shocked the entire galactic community because most civilizations were focused on their own survival and interests, and the idea of risking everything to help strangers was almost unknown. Rebecca found this sad and disturbing because she had always assumed that any civilization advanced enough to travel between stars would also be advanced enough to value cooperation and mutual aid, but apparently technological progress did not necessarily correlate with moral progress. Lyra told her that humans were now being discussed in councils and assemblies across dozens of worlds, and there was serious debate about whether humanity should be invited to join the larger galactic community much earlier than would normally be allowed based on technological development. Alon Rebecca asked what Lyra thought about that, and the Elvani envoy said that she believed humans had something important to teach the rest of the galaxy, and that their willingness to help others, even at great personal cost, was exactly the kind of perspective that the older civilizations had lost over millennia of comfortable existence. Return journey to human space took 8 days, and during that time, Rebecca spent hours composing her report to command and trying to figure out how to explain everything that had happened in a way that would sound believable, because even she had trouble accepting that they had really destroyed an ancient cosmic threat. Messages began arriving from command even before they reached home, and the tone progressed from confusion to disbelief to cautious acceptance as more evidence came in from independent sources confirming the story, and by the time the Defiance docked at Watchtower 7, there was a full diplomatic delegation waiting to debrief them. Rebecca spent 2 weeks in meetings and interviews and briefings with everyone, from military intelligence to the civilian government, and she told the story over and over until the words became automatic and lost all emotional meaning, and she just wanted to go home and sleep for a month. Finally, she was granted leave, and she returned to Earth for the first time in 3 years, and when she stepped off the transport and breathed real air under a real sky, she felt some of the tension that had been building inside her finally begin to release. Her family was waiting at the landing pad, and when they wrapped their arms around her and told her how proud they were and how worried they had been, she finally allowed herself to cry. For all the people who had not made it home, and all the close calls that could have ended differently, the next few months brought enormous changes as humanity suddenly found itself thrust onto the galactic stage, and diplomatic relationships were established with the Elvani coalition and several other major civilizations, and human scientists gained access to technologies that would have taken centuries to develop on their own. Rebecca was promoted and given command of a new ship designed specifically for deep space exploration and diplomatic missions, and she was told that she would be serving as one of humanity's first official ambassadors to the wider galaxy. Rebecca stood on the bridge of her new ship, which was called the Ambassador, and looked out at the stars with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, because she knew that everything she did from this point forward would reflect on all of humanity, and that was a heavy responsibility to carry. Maya had been promoted as well, and now served as Rebecca executive officer, and the two of them had handpicked a crew of the best and brightest officers from across the human fleet, and spent months training them in both military operations and diplomatic protocols. Their first official mission was to visit the Elvani homeworld and participate in a ceremony honoring those who had fought against the Scourge. And Rebecca was nervous about the whole thing because she had never been good at formal events and always felt awkward when people made speeches about her. The journey to the Elvani homeworld took 2 weeks using the new faster-than-light drives that human engineers had developed with help from Elvani technical advisors, and the speed was incredible compared to what the old ships had been capable of achieving when they arrived in orbit. Around the beautiful blue and silver planet that was home to billions of Elvani, Rebecca received a personal message from Lyra inviting her to visit before the official ceremony, and Rebecca accepted gladly because she had been hoping to see her friend again. They met in a garden that overlooked a crystal-clear lake, and the setting was so peaceful and serene that Rebecca found it hard to believe this was the same species that had been fighting desperately for survival just a few months earlier. Lyra looked different, somehow more relaxed and at peace than she had been during their first encounter, and she greeted Rebecca with a warm smile and a gesture that Rebecca had learned was the Elvani equivalent of a hug. They walked together through the garden, while Lyra pointed out various plants and explained their significance in Elvani culture and history, and Rebecca listened with genuine interest because she found the connection between nature and civilization fascinating. Eventually, their conversation turned to more serious matters, and Lyra admitted that she had been struggling with guilt over the fact that her people had hesitated so long before acting against the Scourge, and that hesitation had cost billions of lives. Rebecca told her that guilt was natural, but not productive, and what mattered was that they had eventually done the right thing and saved countless more lives in the process, and dwelling on what might have been would only make it harder to move forward. Ira nodded and said that Rebecca was probably right, but it was hard to let go of the feeling that they should have been braver and acted sooner. And Rebecca understood that completely, because she had her own demons that kept her awake at night. Ceremony itself was held in a massive amphitheater that could hold 100,000 people, and it was filled to capacity with Elvani citizens who wanted to honor the heroes who had saved their civilization. And as Rebecca walked out onto the stage with Maya and the other crew members, she felt overwhelmed by the attention. The Elvani Prime Minister gave a long speech praising the courage and selflessness of the humans who had answered a call not meant for them and risked everything to save people they had never met, and the crowd responded with a thunderous ovation that went on for several minutes. Rebecca was asked to speak, and she had prepared remarks, but when she stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces, she decided to set aside her notes and speak from the heart instead. She told them that humans had not done anything special or heroic, but had simply acted according to the basic principle that when someone needs help, you try to help them regardless of who they are or whether they can repay you. And she believed that this principle was not uniquely human, but rather something that all intelligent beings shared deep down. She said that the real lesson from their experience was not about human exceptionalism, but about the importance of remembering the values that matter most, even when circumstances make it difficult or dangerous to uphold them, and she hoped that all the civilizations in the galaxy could learn to support each other better in the future. The speech was well received, and afterward, dozens of Elvani approached Rebecca, wanting to thank her personally and ask questions about Earth and human culture, and she spent hours talking to them and found that despite their physical differences, they had many of the same hopes and fears and dreams. Over the following months, Rebecca and the ambassador visited a dozen different worlds and established relationships with species that had never had contact with humans before, and everywhere people wanted to hear the story of how humanity had saved the Galaxy Rebecca grew tired of being treated like a celebrity and longed for the simpler days when she was just a patrol captain dealing with routine problems, but she understood that her role now served a larger purpose, and she tried to embrace it as best she was. The galactic community was changing, and humans were at the center of that change, and there was serious discussion about reforming the old alliance structures to create something more inclusive and responsive that could deal with future threats more effectively. Rebecca was invited to participate in these discussions and found herself in rooms with leaders and diplomats from dozens of species, all trying to figure out how to build a better system, and it was frustrating and exciting and exhausting all at the same time. Maya proved to be invaluable during these negotiations because she had a gift for understanding different perspectives and finding common ground, and more than once her suggestions broke through deadlocks that had seemed insurmountable. One day, Rebecca received a message from Lyra asking her to come to a private meeting with no official record or diplomatic protocols, and Rebecca went wondering what could be so sensitive that it required such secrecy. Lyra met her in a small room with no windows and told her that she had discovered something disturbing while researching the ancient records, and it appeared that the scourge was not a natural phenomenon, but rather a weapon created by an even older civilization that had disappeared long before the Velard implications were staggering, because if the scourge was artificial, then there might be others like it. Or worse, things hidden away in forgotten places waiting to be unleashed, and the galaxy was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Rebecca asked why Lyra was telling her this in secret, and Lyra explained that she did not want to cause panic, but she thought that someone needed to know, and she trusted Rebecca to handle the information responsibly and decide how and when to share it. They agreed to keep investigating quietly and to share information only with a small group of trusted individuals who could help research the problem without triggering widespread fear. And Rebecca left the meeting feeling like the weight on her shoulders had just doubled. The next year brought more revelations as researchers uncovered additional evidence of ancient conflicts and lost civilizations, and threats that lurked in the dark spaces between stars and humanity went from being newcomers to the galactic Stage 2 being key players in efforts to understand and prepare for unknown dangers. Rebecca's reputation grew, and she found herself being consulted on matters of strategy and policy by leaders across the galaxy, and while she appreciated their trust, she sometimes missed the simplicity of her old life when the hardest decision she had to make was which Sector 2 patrol. Maya noticed Rebecca growing stress and suggested that they take some time off to visit a remote colony world where they could relax and forget about politics and ancient threats for a while, and Rebecca agreed, because she desperately needed a break. They spent 2 weeks on a beautiful planet with purple skies and crystal forests, and did nothing but hike and swim and talk about anything except work, and for the first time in months, Rebecca felt like she could breathe again when they returned. Rebecca felt refreshed and ready to tackle the challenges ahead, and she realized that she had been given an incredible opportunity to shape the future not just of humanity, but of the entire galaxy, and that was something worth working for. Ambassador continued its missions, and over time, the crew became like a family to Rebecca, and she valued their perspectives and contributions, and knew that none of their successes would have been possible without their dedication and skill. 3 years after the destruction of the scourge, a new threat emerged in a distant sector, and the response was immediate and coordinated with ships from a dozen different civilizations working together to contain and neutralize the danger before it could spread. Rebecca watched the operation from the bridge of the Ambassador and felt a sense of satisfaction, because this was exactly what they had been working toward, and it proved that the galaxy had learned from the mistakes of the past and was now better prepared to face whatever came next. Lyra sent her a message congratulating her on building such an effective coalition, and Rebecca replied that it was not her achievement alone, but rather the result of countless people from many worlds choosing to work together. Instead of pursuing their own interest, the future remained uncertain, and there would always be new challenges and new threats, but Rebecca felt confident that humanity and its allies would face them together, and that made all the difference.